Hello and welcome to Flight to Freedom. And today we have a very special guest, Dr Menije. Dr Menije is a licensed psychologist in a private practice in Los Angeles. She's a leading expert on overcoming perfectionism and building an authentic life. As the founder of Perfectionism University, an online platform for self-help courses on breaking up with perfectionism, her goal is to create a community where we can all unlearn perfectionism and start our journey of embracing imperfections and owning our enoughness. Dr. Menije, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I'm so grateful to you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's my pleasure.
If it's okay with you, I'm going to start with a few little icebreaker questions, and then we will get on with the podcast. So, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So last night I did a meditation. It was about a 2.5 hour long meditation. And one of the intention and the advice that we seem to keep coming back to was trusting the process. And it spoke to me about trusting ourselves, trusting our experiences, as hard as some of them might be. So I think recently, and I imagine for the rest of my life, one of the advice that I'm going to hold dear to my heart is trusting the process.
That's brilliant, but not easy to do.
Not at all. Not at all. It takes a lot of, it takes a lot of breath, and it takes a lot of reminders.
Okay. When you were a child, what did you most want to be when you grew up?
Oh my, I actually changed my mind quite a lot. It's funny because I did that as an adult as well, but I used to play teacher all the time, and I had, and I would write on my walls, which drove my parents crazy. But one of the things I wanted to be from a young age was to be a teacher.
Oh, that's awesome. I wanted to be a giant Snoopy.
That's so cool. That actually sounds fun. Yes.
I didn't realize that I couldn't actually grow up and become a Snoopy, but still. If you were a dog, what breed of dog would you be?
Oh, I think I have a special love in my heart for German Shepherds.
Oh, cool. Forever puppies.
But puppies wise, I do have to say Huskies also melt my heart. The Siberian Husky puppies, my goodness, you just want to cuddle them.
Just like giant fluffy pom-poms, aren't they?
Yes.
If you could wave a magic wand and make one thing happen, what would it be?
Oh, that's a very good question. What would that be? Oh. My heart is saying, bring more play into my life. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. Everyone needs more play, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And the last question, what quality do you most admire in others?
Compassion and understanding.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be the perfectionism queen?
I feel like I'm still in a journey of recovering from my perfectionism. And there's such a personal story here, because about a decade ago, I was reading Dr. Brené Brown's book, Gifts of Imperfections. And it was life-changing for me because it gave me so much insight into some of the anxiety and the guilt-driven, worry-driven kind of a state of mind I have had most of my life. And I start to understand about the perfectionism behind it. And some of it, of course, does go back to earlier life experiences too. I moved to the United States from Turkey 2 weeks before I turned 15. And that gave my therapist and I a lot to work with.
Yes.
So, but it was, again, a decade ago, reading the book, I'm understanding about my own pursuit of perfectionism and how that was something I was leaning into to cope with anxiety and self-esteem. And what ended up happening in the next few years is I completed my degree. I am doing my trainings now. I'm offering therapy. And what I start to see is so many people also struggle with perfectionism, but we don't really like raise our hand and say it. At the time, at least this was a decade ago, where people come to therapy complaining of, understandably, anxiety, sleep issues, relationship issues, breakup, divorce, addiction. That was another area that I specialize in. And what I was finding out behind these types of mental or emotional stresses lied a lot of perfectionism. And when I start to see how much it was coming up in my kind of professional role as much as my personal life, it really became a passion of mine to keep learning more about it and sharing more about it, and hopefully giving someone out there a piece of clarity on perfectionism one day at a time.
That's so awesome. I didn't actually realize that I struggled with perfectionism until I started my recovery from anorexia. Mm-hmm. And it was only when my coach started pointing things out to me that I realized literally how perfect I tried to be all the time. Is that common that people don't even realize?
Absolutely. It's very common because it becomes so ingrained in us. I think these types of perfectionistic expectations we have of ourselves, whether it is regarding our bodies, how our body needs to look, how our bodies have to perform, to how we perform and show up at work and relationships. I believe it became so ingrained, and it becomes a person's primary way of looking at things. So it becomes very it's second nature to people. And that's another challenge in understanding and uncovering one's perfectionism, is a denial. Like, oh, I'm not a perfectionist. What are you talking about? You know, I can't get this right. This doesn't look right on me. And of course, we see all the imperfections. So absolutely, I think it's very common for us to be a bit unaware. And I think what tends to, and maybe this will resonate with you as well, what starts the journey of uncovering perfectionism tends to be a consequence of perfectionism. So it was whether an eating disorder or depression or codependency. So we end up, and that's the other thing, I hope I'm not going all over the place here, but this is another thing I talk to people about perfectionism, where it may seem nice and okay or doable in the beginning, but if you play the tape forward, maybe 6 months down the road or 3 years down the road, the perfectionism is going to eat you alive. And so I do think that the way people again uncover their perfectionism tends to be because they are dealing with the consequence of their perfectionism that is obviously intolerable, unbearable. And underneath that, we start to like peel that onion and find the perfectionism sitting there, cross its arms and telling us what to do.
Do you think there is actually a perfectionist personality? Are people born perfectionists, or is it from worries about societal acceptance and parental conditioning and all that sort of thing?
I would say both, and not to take the easy answer here, but truly the answer is both for this reason, which I hope will explain itself. I think what we're naturally wired is for connection and sense of belonging.
Yes.
And again, Dr. Brené Brown's research has wonderful data showing us how many of us use perfectionism to quote unquote improve ourselves so that we can belong. You know, so when you look at, like, again, when you keep going down that track and ask yourself, why am I trying to do this perfectly? Why does it matter so much for me that this turns out perfect, whether it's my body, my hair, the way I talk? It's because people will not abandon me, or I will be loved, or I will feel enough. So I think what's innate and a wiring of us, which is technically very necessary, is that we're social beings and we want belongings. And so I'm afraid that will always put us at risk of developing perfectionism. And that's actually one of the reasons why I always tell people perfectionism will always be there. and it latches on to things you value. So when I became a mom for the first time 6 years ago, that's like what, 5 years after I, been working on my perfectionism. And it was so ready to come out, because it said to me, well, if you want to be a good mom, you got to do this perfectly. You got to, sleep train her and, cuddle her and read all the books. So again, I think perfectionism does unfortunately put us at risk, because we're so wired for social connection, and we care to, we want to belong, we want to feel enough. However, as you mentioned, certain life events and environments can exacerbate that. So it doesn't mean everybody's, because I definitely don't want to come across like I think everybody is perfectionism. No, I don't believe that. So clearly there are certain life experiences that I think exacerbates that, like, moving to a new country, and obviously current social media platforms, all the filters. And I see in my clients, grief can lead to perfectionism, because we try to be perfect after we lost mom, so that nobody knows how much pain we're in, or nobody thinks we are damaged or broken. So there's so many life events, as you mentioned, also parents, the way parents and teachers, coaches, mentors.
So a lot of criticism in your childhood can really lay the path for a lot of struggles with perfectionism as you grow older.
It does. And there's few layers to that. There's that classic, meaning the commonly assumed parent-child relationship, where the demanding parent, high achiever parent, imposes perfectionism into the child. Absolutely. But that's not the only kind of parent-child relationship we want to look for. The other one we want to look for is a parent who themselves have a lot of perfectionism that they're not worked on. So as you know, as a parent, we model a lot of things, and children learn from examples. So I've also seen people develop perfectionism, not because the parents were so, achievement oriented. It's because they didn't dealt with their own perfectionism, their own anxiety. With eating disorder, I've found a similar pattern, where my clients who struggle with eating disorder or disordered eating, their mothers, not to, again, stereotype here, but I'm just specifically talking to about a female client I worked with, their mothers modeled that kind of like, what would everybody think? And
so
I got to dress properly.
Yeah. Yes, so much. That was a huge part of my childhood of, well, you've got to put on a good front. What will people think? You mustn't let the family down. And so much so. So are there like warning signs? Are there like typical signs that people can look out for?
Absolutely. So I want to, if I can maybe go over what the definition of perfectionism is, because that will kind of give away, I think, one of the main symptoms to look out for. Clearly, definition of perfectionism is our interest and our pursuit of perfectionism. But I want to say a little bit more than just that, because it's not just about wanting to do things perfectly, because we all obviously can agree that we want to do our best. With perfectionism, it's more about how I judge, criticize, and shame myself when there's anything less than perfect about me.
Yes.
So any of my shortcomings, which I have many, any of my flaws, any of my imperfections and mistakes are treated with so much judgment and disapproval, rather than compassion and kindness and empathy. That's the core thing about perfectionism. It's not just that I want to do things perfectly. Like, I will love this chat we're having to turn out perfectly, but guess what? I'm probably going to butcher something or say something.
And if you don't, I will.
Well, that's why I know I'm in good company, because I'm with like imperfect people supporting each other. And so that's, again, the point here is that if as soon as I make a mistake, I go into a war with myself, and I am beating myself up over that mistake I've made. The way I was short with my kid, the way I forgot an appointment, the way that I didn't checking with my partner, those values that I have, I didn't live up to them today. And man, I will just beat myself up. So having said that, that being, again, what really perfectionism is about is how we, again, judge, shame, criticize our imperfections. I believe one of the things we can always look out for in younger children or in our adulthood is how are we responding when we make mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, a tell-all sign of, I don't want to say overcoming perfectionism, but definitely I want to say, like, keeping it at bay, is being tolerable and understanding and compassionate when we make mistakes and we are falling short on something.
Yes. So that does resonate so much. I say used to because I am doing so much better at not doing this now, but I used to be so harsh and so critical to myself. And if I was, say, writing a sheet of something, handwriting, because I don't particularly like typing, and I was writing something out, if I made one mistake, I'd have to start all over again, the whole thing. And I could spend hours and hours doing it till it looked perfect because nothing else was acceptable. And it would waste so much time. But then I'd be constantly telling myself how useless I was for not doing it perfectly, and look at how much time I'm wasting because I'm so stupid and not able to do it right the first time or the second or the third. And that just followed through, even down to, I had to have my bed made, the cushions all in a certain order and everything. Otherwise, I was just like lazy and messy and just so many things. And my recovery coach actually made me leave a cushion on the living room floor for an entire day. And I was like, oh, that's ridiculous. That's a stupid thing to do. Why would I want to do that? And it killed me. It was so hard. It was insanely hard. And then my dogs added another cushion to the floor, and I thought my head was going to explode.
I am loving that with so much joy right now. That is such a beautiful, yes, those are the moments where, as you just gave such a, powerful example, is we have to tolerate things being imperfect. And sometimes I encourage people, as you mentioned, working on themselves, to intentionally do things imperfectly. Leave the kitchen with the dishes, the sink with the dishes piled up at nighttime, or, and some of them can be silly, like wear mismatched socks, or
I couldn't do that. Oh my goodness. You just set my head spinning.
Anything that we could maybe look, again, not inappropriate in a rude way, but like something that, again, like that's not how you're supposed to do it, because that's what perfectionism says. That's not how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to do it this way. Yeah. And that's another, I think, symptom or sign of perfectionism, is that kind of rigidity. It's a very rule-based, rule-driven mindset where there's a very particular way things need to be done for them to be, quote unquote, perfect for the person. So I think uncovering your perfectionism is also journaling about these rules that you've been placing on yourself and that you have expected yourself to comply. And you will see that these rules are very rigid, very excessive, quite unattainable, and maybe sometimes don't even make sense. Why does the dishes always have to be all cleaned up before you go to bed? Yes, that's a nice routine, so that maybe your morning starts with a little bit, ease, but it doesn't make you lazy, right? And that's another thing you just touched on that was really powerful. Perfectionists have the worst, not only the inner critic we talked about, but they also have the worst, like, self-esteem and self-love. They do not see themselves. And that's another thing people misperceive, I think, is perfectionism as narcissists. And that's when in therapy, people are like, oh, I couldn't be a perfectionist. I do so many things wrong and I have zero confidence. I'm like, you are exactly the definition of perfectionism, because deep down, perfectionists believe I am not smart enough. I'm not talented enough. I am not deserving to be here. I am inadequate. I'm incompetent. I'm lazy. I'm unlovable. I'm unattractive. I'm too fat. I'm too old for this. I'm too young for this. So those are, again, those negative labels.
So it all comes back to not feeling good enough.
It really does. I genuinely believe that the core suffering for perfectionism is believing we're not enough as we are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm too short, I'm too tall, I'm too fat, I'm too thin. This is a crazy story. I'm sometimes embarrassed to say, but I have to push myself to share it. A decade ago in my 20s, I had a moment where I thought to myself, I want to go get speech therapy to correct my accent because I don't sound smart enough.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Like, it's that kind of, feeling like there's something about you that's less than, that is going to, again, make you, I believe, unworthy of belonging and unworthy of connection.
Hence why it's so closely tied in for people with eating disorders, because they never feel enough and don't think that they can be accepted as they are in any way, shape, or form. And the lengths that certainly I used to go to are quite extreme to try and be in a body that was accepted, the body that was good enough, that people could find acceptable. And outside validation actually makes it worse, so much worse, because when you come across as doing something well and you get praised for it, it kind of compounds it. Do you find that?
Absolutely. And it does. And that's where, again, parent-child relationship or teacher-student relationship becomes so impactful, not because, again, you have this one particular parent or teacher who's so strict and rigid. It's also the ones that unintentionally reward how well a child did something. And I know this gets a little tricky because people sometimes kind of assume the opposite, where are we not supposed to say kind words to children? Of course we are. But I think that we have to, as much as we say kind words, maybe we can also make time to process when they are not doing that great, when they're having a hard time, and how normal it is that nobody has the best, same attention span every day. And some days it's going to be harder for you to focus than other days. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that the more something that's like rewarded, it makes it harder to let go. And that's what I often also talk to people about. When you let your perfectionism go, let's be prepared that there are going to be some consequences. People are going to be shocked and surprised, and they may even be upset with you. What do you mean you can't cook, bring me over during a meal for our gathering this weekend? Like, they're so dependent on you being so reliable and helpful as a perfectionist and people pleaser. People don't necessarily right off the bat understand some of these new boundaries that you are practicing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had to put in boundaries and it didn't go down brilliantly with everybody. I think everybody did understand when I took the time to explain. But I can see how it can be very tricky for some people.
And I think it's hard to sometimes explain it to people, because I also feel that there's still a minimization of perfectionism, where people think, oh, you struggle with perfectionism, how sweet, you just want to do things really great. Oh, that's like that's a sweet problem to have. Or is that really a problem to have? People have trauma, people have I'm sure your experience might be different, but I feel like there's almost a little bit more empathy towards a clinical diagnosis like anorexia versus if you were to say, I struggle with perfectionism. So I'm afraid even when we try to talk about perfectionism, there's still, again, like minimization, that it couldn't be that bad. All you want is just things to be nice. And it's like telling people it really is not about me wanting things to be nice. It's about how much I hate myself when I don't do things well.
Yeah, I can see that, definitely. So would you say that one of the most important factors, and I'm just guessing here because it's not my area of expertise at all, but it's self-compassion and self-love and learning how to say, it's okay, sweetheart, you're human. It's part of the human experience to make mistakes, and no human is perfect. And just to
Yes.
be okay with that.
Yes, it is. Because I think it's about changing that inner critic to that inner cheerleader and inner compassionate voice. Because we need an alternative option here, right? Like, we are going to make mistakes because we're imperfect human beings by nature. We're going to let people down in our lives. And sometimes we're going to say the wrong thing. Sometimes we're going to use the wrong tone of voice. And it's about holding ourselves with kindness and self-love in those moments, like genuinely like holding ourselves with understanding and empathy when it happens. And as you gave those beautiful affirmations, speaking to yourself like people that you speak to, other people that you love, you got to speak to yourself with that self-love. And I do want to come back to what you were saying earlier with the pillow. I think it's I do cognitive and behavioral therapy. And so I believe in the power of reframing our thoughts and making sure we're replacing our negative thoughts with the positive ones, kinder ones. But also behaviorally, we have to make choices that really aligns with that. So sometimes that's making mistakes intentionally. And other times it's setting boundaries with people and saying, no, I can't help you with that today. Even though that's going to make me look less than, it's going to make me look less strong or less capable or competent in your eyes. I have to take that chance.
That's, so good. Wow. Such a big subject, isn't it? It's just like so much bigger than you first ever imagined. It's huge.
Really,
it's linked into so much.
Yes, I mean it shows up at work. It shows up in our personal, like, physical routines, our exercise routines, and our appearances. It shows up in relationships in terms of, like I mentioned, people pleasing and codependency. Then there's religion. Then there's finances, and you can have another journal entry on how perfectionism shows up in your religious and spiritual practices, how perfectionism shows up in your finances, and some of the because that's another topic that shows up a lot for people is money, and how disapproving they get of themselves if they make a money mistake.
Wow, yeah. So what would be, say somebody's recognized that they have this low self-worth and they are struggling with perfectionism, and they now recognize that. What's the next step? What should they then do?
I think it has to first start with what we were just talking about, is gathering where in your life is it showing up. And when you, like, is it with your relationship with your body and food? And clearly, if that is showing up in your relationship with body and food, how severe it is, because nutrition and healthy nutrition, and as you know, people with eating disorder can actually struggle with a lot of mortality issues because it could get very severe. So again, if it's showing up in your relationship with food and body, I would assume that must be one of the primary one of the first things you want to address, compared to it's showing up in your finances, or compared to maybe it's showing up in your relationship with your partner. While relationship is important, I would start with you. So again, I would ask people to identify where in my life does perfectionism show up. And I guess with that, they would have to also identify how it's showing up, meaning what are the expectations I have of myself?
Yeah.
And if that even sounds vague to people, here's another way I would word it. What do you tell yourself you should do today? well, I should do the laundry and I should go for an hour run. And then I should be checking up on my mom because I haven't called her all week. Like, look at your to-do list. That shows me what are the expectations you have of yourself.
How much you should all over yourself all day.
Yes, yes, yes. And as you mentioned, people can start with some self-compassionate practices that, as we just mentioned, I like people to just consider, like, close their eyes, choose someone they love in their lives, and consider how they speak to those people, especially if they have the interest. I would like them to visualize that person they love. Let's call it one's best friend. Imagine your best friend having the same problem you're having today. How would you respond to them? Now, tell yourself those words.
Yeah. You wouldn't call your best friend a stupid, lazy bitch that can't do anything right, would you?
Exactly. Yep. You would not.
And if you did, she wouldn't be a friend for long.
Yes. Which is why, again, the perfectionism is so self-abandoning. You are not being your friend.
Yeah.
You are not having your own back. You are not looking after yourself. You're not taking care of yourself.
Which is really sad when literally the only person you are always with is yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a sad existence. And it's a lonely existence when you are so cruel to yourself the whole time.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us about the Perfectionism University.
Oh, I would love to. Yes. So I launched it back in 2021. And what I love about the platform is there are a couple of resources out there for people. If they're interested, I do have a free 6-step email course that they can have for free, where I'll just send them 6 different emails walking them through things they can do to overcome perfectionism.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes, so there's a free resource. Then I put together a course with 23 videos with worksheets, walking them through unpacking their perfectionism, diving into the thoughts, the inner critic and the rules, then wrapping it up with tools and skills and tips on overcoming it. So it's a 23 course video. It takes about 6 hours to complete it.
Wow. That's amazing. And that's all online?
Yes, it's all online. It's perfectionismuniversity.com.
Fantastic. And we'll add that into the show notes as well.
Thank you.
It's been so lovely having you on today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that I haven't asked a question of, or anything you want to leave the listeners with?
No, I loved our conversation. I think one more thought that I might want to leave them with is, speaking of how we can work on our perfectionism, I would also encourage people to start finding ways to pausing and taking a breath. Even if that means pausing and taking 3 breaths in through your nose, as you know, out through your mouth. And then looking into doing some 5-minute, 10-minute meditation, maybe every other day, maybe beginning of your day. I can't imagine, again, what meditation does is teaches us how to be self-aware of our body, how to notice when there's tension in our body. And I think that's also a telltale sign. I'm doing something that doesn't align with me.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, if anybody wants to go and check out the Perfectionism University and get a free course, that's definitely something I'm going to go and look at in a minute. Go to perfectionismuniversity.com. If anyone's looking at starting their recovery or wants help with eating disorder recovery, give me a shout at juliadrahane.com. And thank you so much for listening today. Super grateful to you for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Menije, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here.